Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.20 mid lane tier list. In this video, I'm going to talk about the changes, obviously, that happened in patch 14.20. I'll also talk about some of the things that we've just kind of figured out since patch 14.19. I'll also talk about just, why kind of some of the strongest champs are up here, some of the champions I've moved around, and also, because it's been often requested in the comment section below, I'll talk about some of the blind picks and stuff at the end. So make sure to check the timestamps in the description. I'll make sure to cover a whole bunch of different stuff. So our first changes here that we care about a lot are the Stormsurge and the Luden's changes. So both of these are basically just to overall reduce the amount of burst damage from AP burst. And AP burst champs have been fairly strong, and one of the champs that has used this the most is Syndra. Now that being said, I think that even though the Luden's and Stormsurge nerfs are fairly sizable, right, like there is a fair amount of damage being lost in both cases, I think there are alternatives, right? Like I think that Shadow Flame is still a very solid second item if you're playing a flat pen build. So I don't think Stormsurge being nerfed is like a huge negative because, again, you can build that instead. I also think for the champions that were building double pen sometimes, so stuff like Akali where you go Stormsurge and Shadow Flame, I think it's very possible that you can still just play like Lichbane and Stormsurge, or Lichbane and Shadowflame, probably more likely, and that's going to be completely fine. So I actually don't think this is too big a nerf in that there's plenty of other options available, and I don't think the champions will be heavily affected by this. The Luden's one is definitely a little bit bigger because some champs don't really have other options. So, for the chapter items, I think that Seraph's is pretty strong. I think Blackfire after the buffs is pretty strong. Malignance is kind of whatever. Now I think Luden's it's still okay, but it's kind of whatever as well. So I expect that, champions that could kind of choose between multiple, right? Like stuff like Hwei that could go, say, like Luden's, Seraph's, or Blackfire. Probably just looking at stuff like Blackfire now. Like, I don't think you'd think about Luden's. So really, this hard affects the ones that relied on Luden's. And the big ones I can think of are LeBlanc and Zoe. LeBlanc, I think it's still very strong. I'll talk about her a bit later, but I've put her down a little bit, and I think that's a big part of it for me, is like that's a fair amount less damage. Probably the same for Zoe. At the same time, like both these champs are doing very well at the moment, so it's probably not too bad. Syndra, I have kept an S tier. Again, I'll talk about her a little bit more, but I do think there are still other options. Like I think Seraph's is a decent item, and you can still play something like Seraph's into Shadowflame if you're solo AP. And to be honest, I think that Luden's probably is still viable if you want to, but she's definitely not married to the item. So yeah, overall, I think these changes, they are like a slight nerf, but I actually don't think it's going to have far-reaching effects, I guess, on the mid lane meta. Another big change is the grasp change here, which is kind of just meant to make it so that it's like really good on tanks, basically, and not as good on other champs. So this is a nerf to things like Yasuo and Yone that were really hard abusing grasp, and also to some range laners. Like you even saw people taking grasp on Ahri at Worlds. You've seen obviously a lot of grasp smolder when they were playing that mid. So this seems like a fairly sizable nerf. Like they're going to be a lot squishier, or not a ton squishier, but there is like going to be a fair amount of missing health here, I think, as you get into the kind of mid game. And that's really where Yasuo and Yone became OP, is that these were champs that the whole time they've been unable to really be pushed out of lane due to the insane sustain with building Bork, but they're always very squishy in fights. But with the grasp and Stridebreaker builds, they've been very, very hard to kill, and so that was kind of what was making them very overtuned. Now, as a result of this, they actually went and buffed Yone and Yasuo, which was basically just to increase their damage with crit. And, I've seen a lot of people freaking out about this because it's like, okay, if Yasuo and Yone are so strong in 14.19, which I think they are, why are they receiving a buff? The thing is, I actually don't know if this will do anything, and the reason is that I think, again, specifically what makes these champs OP is they're able to do a lot of damage while not building crit and being very, very tanky, especially Yone. I think Yone is a much bigger offender than Yasuo is. So yeah, I guess we'll see how the new builds work out, but like honestly, if they end up doing more damage and being way squishier, I think that would actually be a pretty big nerf to Yasuo and Yone. So my feeling is that they're probably going to be like fairly power neutral. But the thing is, like, they were already quite strong, right? So I'm keeping them here for now, but we should keep an eye on them, because if they end up, if somehow like the Bork into Stridebreaker build or Bork into other tank items ends up being suboptimal compared to crit, then honestly they'll probably drop because they'll be so much easier to deal with in team fights. There's a couple of ADC changes as well, which are there's some small buffs to Tristana, and then there's also some changes here to Corki. It doesn't really seem to me like either of these make a huge difference, and I still have them quite low on my tier list. I will talk about Tristana specifically later, but yeah, I feel like the quirky changes kind of seem whatever. Like, I don't think he really has like a great niche at the moment. It's not like he has the insane like lane bully and scaling potential that he did before. Tristana honestly has way more potential to come up, but I will come back to that when I start to talk about champions individually. Finally, there was this direct nerf to Veigar, which I think is mainly skewed towards lower MMRs, which is actually what they say here. And I think the reason for this is that Veigar did have a high win rate, which was probably just because in lower elos where games are going longer and people aren't as good in lane, that Veigar was, you know, considered to be strong. The thing is though, like Veigar this whole time has been very bad in high elo, and the main reason for that is the mid meta is just so bad for him, right? Like if you're playing Veigar mid into some of these longer range mages like an Ori, Hwei, or Syndra, it's kind of like a good luck in esports. I actually saw way more Veigar bot lane on this patch, and to be honest, I do think that Veigar ADC is actually probably his best role, because you don't get punished so hard in bot lane, you know, unless you're against some sort of double range lane like Caitlyn Lux or something. So I like Veigar bot a lot more than Veigar mid. I think Veigar mid is still not very good, and it's kind of sad that he gets a nerf because, again, I think this is specifically for low elo, and maybe he needs some sort of redesign because, you know, again, like it's so odd, I guess, to see a champ that is already so weak in high elo getting nerfed, but I suppose it makes sense if it's absolutely terrorizing the lower elos. Now, onto the tier list itself, I quickly wanted to talk about items again, because I talked about items a lot in the previous one, and I think I remember saying that it felt like Horizon and Lichbane specifically were very, very strong. I think Horizon is definitely really, really good. Lichbane, I think, is not quite as good as I thought it was. I still think it's like a pretty solid item, but it's not, I don't think it's like meta defining. You're not seeing champs in the meta specifically because they use Lichbane. Other good items, I mean, Seraphs and Blackfire are both quite good. I think Seraphs, you know, didn't get much of a nerf, and it's super solid. It just has been the whole time, especially with Luden's being nerfed as a competitor to it. Blackfire getting some base damage buffs. I used to be a Blackfire hater, but I think after the base damage buffs actually does quite a bit of damage. And I've always liked Blackfire by design. The whole last split I spent complaining that it just didn't really do enough damage, but now that they've fixed the numbers, it feels quite good. So I think Blackfire and Seraphs are really good. Champs that can use one of those two are also feeling quite good, especially ones that can really nicely transition into Horizon 2nd, which is a lot of these champs up here. I also talked last time about Liandry and how I kind of felt like Liandry sort of sucked because it got a lot of damage knocked off it, despite, you know, the fights actually going longer. And I've kind of reversed my opinion on Liandry sucking, but sort of for a different reason. So one of the biggest downsides of going Liandry 2nd is that you have no CDR, right? Like that's a really big problem compared to something like Horizon, which is giving you 25 more ability haste. And that can be a pretty big negative because a lot of the time when you're playing against these like tankier targets, you're playing longer fights, just having more rotations is actually going to end up more damage than Liandry. And I think for some champs, that's certainly the case. But I would say Liandry is actually in probably the perfect spot right now where it's a good buy into champs that have high HP, and it's not good into champs with low HP. And you're probably thinking, okay, that sounds obvious, but the reason I bring that up is because all last split, you could basically buy Liandry no matter what comp the enemy had, and it was just a good item. So now it's kind of correctly filling its situational slot, and I think something that actually makes Liandry a lot better than people realize is how much CDR you can get from your runes. So if you're a champ that runs a heavy CDR page, like let's say you play something like this, to where you've got, you know, extra CDR from Transcendence, you've got a ton of extra base ability, I guess, what are they called? Normal abilities? Okay, yeah, they are called basic ability haste, so everything except your R. And a lot of champs also, if they're in a lane that's less contested, can take ability haste. So even though your Liandry is not actually providing you with much CDR, you can still get quite a lot if you're running some sort of page like this. And a lot of mages do run this. Now, if you're in a matchup where, you know, you're, I don't know, rushing an item that doesn't build out a CDR, like let's say you're rushing, I don't know, Rod of Ages or something, and you're also playing some sort of page that doesn't have CDR, then it's much harder to go Liandry. So for example, like let's say you're playing like Lissandra versus LeBlanc, and you've got some sort of page like this, right? Like you are lacking a lot of extra cooldown reduction. And so with this build, like you would definitely not be able to go, say, Roa Liandry, because you would just have like no CDR whatsoever. Now you could probably go Blackfire Liandry, and that is normal on Lissandra anyway. I guess I wasn't really meaning to use Lissandra specifically as an example. What I more meant is that Liandry 2nd is much more valuable, I guess, on champions that do have access to a lot of extra CDR from their rune pages, or aren't, you know, reliant on CDR, right? Like a champ like Azir, for example, doesn't really care about giving up that CDR because he's mainly caring about other stuff anyway. So hopefully that makes some sort of sense. Basically, I think Seraphs, Horizon, Blackfire, Liandry all seem to be very solid items at the moment. Let's go through the S tier like I normally do. A lot of these explanations are going to be similar to the previous patch because not much has changed. I think Orianna is currently the best mid in the game, at least in my opinion. It's really, really good with the AD junglers, and also she has a variety of runes that she can run. So you can run, for example, some phase rush gathering storm page into a lot of the melees. You can easily poke out range champs with comet builds. So you've got this super strong lane, you scale really, really well, you abuse current strong items, right? You can go Seraph's Horizon, which feels really nice, and she's also a solid blind. So I think overall, just great champion. Pretty much nothing wrong with her. The only downside, I guess, is maybe lack of mobility. But again, with phase rush, you can kind of make up for this, and Seraph's makes you a little tankier as well. Hwei is feeling super good. So Hwei makes use of all these OP items. You can run Blackfire into either Horizon or Liandry, and they're both really, really good. He also has good matchups into a lot of the other stronger mids, or at least is capable of neutralizing. I will say a little bit of Hwei's strength could even depend on your server, as weird as that sounds. So one thing, because I've been playing in EU West a lot lately, is that there's a lot of Hwei bots on my server. A lot of Hwei's in the ADC position. And the reason that's important is because Hwei is somewhat counterable, right? Like I said, he has like decent matchups, but there are also some harder matchups. And the thing is, if you have Hwei, I guess, his flex potential, it's a lot harder to pick into him. Now, when I played on Korea, basically no one played AP bot pretty much ever. Only really Ziggs was the champ, the only AP I saw bot lane. But on EU, I see AP bot all the time. I've seen plenty of Lux, I've been sitting plenty of Hwei. I imagine this is similar to NA as well. I think just Western regions are much more likely to play AP bots. So in that sense, I think, well, probably for most of us watching, Hwei does have flex potential, but that is some of his strengths. So keep that in mind as well. Yeah, he does a ridiculous amount of damage, and is also capable of dealing with most threats. Like, he is fairly mobile, as well as having a self-peel. So unless there's like hard engage like Jarvan, other than that, it can pretty much be dealt with whatever situation you encounter. Lissandra, I have been having so much success with Lissandra, and I've seen a lot of people question the position of her on the tier list. Like, why is Liss so high if her itemization is awkward and if she has like tough matchups into the other APs? And it is true, like, you do have tough matchups into these. I wouldn't go and pick Lissandra into these champs, but if you end up blinding Lissandra and playing versus these champs, personally, I would say it's fine. Combos like Lissandra and Jarvan, Lissandra Veigar, Lissandra Hwei, all of these are so hard to survive against as these mages here. And also, even if Lissandra falls behind, she's actually very, very good in teamfights. While there is awkward itemization for her, like, I do think that's true, there are ways of playing around it. So, for example, like, I think Zhonya's is still a very good second item if you're not sure what to buy. You can't really use Horizon, which is probably the biggest downside. You can use the Liandry if it's the right game for it. But I also think there are double mana builds that can work on Liss. So for example, I think you can play something like Blackfire Ludens or even Blackfire Malignants if you don't know what else to build. So there's definitely always option. That's just like a little weird compared to other champs. But yeah, I think she's overall really, really strong. I'll kind of show my OPGG at the end and talk about, when I pick Lissandra and what situations. But I think she's amazing as a counter pick, like probably the best counter pick on the patch, while also being like a fairly functional blind pick as well. Syndra, yeah, she did get nerfed because of some of the items, but I think just Syndra as a champ is kind of broken at the moment. Like, she's good versus other mages, good with AD junglers, does kind of suffer from lack of mobility. That's probably the biggest one. But she can use Horizon. She can use Seraphs if she needs to. So I think her itemization is probably still fine. And most bad matchups can be dealt with as well. Moving on to the A tier. So these are the champions that I would say aren't quite on the level of these ones, but are still kind of the champions you want to play if you want to elo inflate yourself. So first one is LeBlanc. I moved down LeBlanc a little bit, mainly because I think she is one of the champs hit hardest by the Luden's change. And also think in general that if you play against a comp like Ori plus a hypercarry or Lissandra plus a hypercarry, it can actually be quite difficult for LeBlanc to end up killing AD carries. So it's not necessary that she became just like way weaker, but I think it's like much more important than before that you are playing LeBlanc as solo AP. I think that while LeBlanc can use Horizon second, she definitely uses it not as well as some of the champs up here, because ability haste is useful, but not, again, as valuable as these champs up here. So you really do want to be going flat pen second, but if you end up on a team with a lot of APs, or even just one additional AP in jungle or top, that can make your life really difficult. So basically, I think she's still really, really broken. You just need to be a tiny bit more careful about how you're picking her and make sure you're not in some like super unplayable situation. Yone, kind of talked about it before, expecting to still be very, very strong. I think that It's possible the grasp changes make him, you know, like significantly weaker, but I still feel like he has other keystones, and I think the champ is so overtuned that even if he is weaker, he's likely to still be strong. He's very good into most mages just because, like, well, he wins 1v1 on side, really good gank setup in laning phase, can't really be pushed out of lane, and he also scales very well. So yeah, probably the best AD mid on the patch, I'd say. Ahri is another one I've moved a tiny bit down, but I actually don't think Ahri has gotten any weaker. Like, you guys are probably wondering, you know, why have I moved her down then? I think, honestly, I just, like, overrated her a little bit before. I still think she's very, very good. I definitely think that people should be spamming quite a lot of Ahri. The main reason I have her lower is because, for me, I typically go towards Lissandra or LeBlanc before I go to Ahri. And the reason for that is that, like, Lissandra typically deals with matchups you're picking. Like, if you're countering, you're going to win a matchup harder with Lissandra than you are with Ahri. As in... And that might not necessarily mean you solo kill them in lane, like it is a harder counter pick than Ahri is. Like Ahri is more of a neutralizer. And I personally prefer LeBlanc over Ahri, although I will say, and probably the biggest argument for Ahri, is that Ahri is kind of fine with being duo AP, because Ahri's best builds don't have flat pen in them anyway, right? Like the best Ahri builds are to go something like Malignant's Horizon or Malignant's Liandry, so you're much less reliant on being solo AP compared to LeBlanc. So in that sense, Ahri might be a better blind over LeBlanc at the moment, at least in terms of team comps, but matchup-wise can lose a lot harder, right? Like I think LeBlanc is kind of winning versus Ori, kind of winning versus Syndra, but Ahri, I think, loses both these matchups without jungler intervention. So, yeah, I don't know. There's trade-offs here. I still think they're both very strong. Zoe, I think... I had her really highly rated, and I think she is still really, really good. Biggest nerf is the Luden's change, but she got a couple, like, hidden things. So, obviously, Lichbane is still really good. Horizon's a solid second item if you want it. You also have flat pen options, which is great. One little thing that went under the radar is there was a Nimbus Cloak buff this patch, which actually really helps Zoe. Zoe likes Nimbus Cloak, and I have seen a couple Zoe one-tricks this patch. One running Electrocute primary, Sorcery secondary, and taking Nimbus Cloak. And then I saw another Zoe one trick going Airy primary, and I think he went, I want to say Precision secondary, can't quite remember, but he also had Nimbus Cloak. And both these Zoe one tricks had very, very high win rates. So it's a champ that I want to experiment with more. I've only played her a few times. I've had, you know, a lot of good games on her, but I don't actually think I've won a lot. But I think I averaged 10 kills or something. But yeah, I think the champ is strong. Need to experiment a bit more with her. Wouldn't be surprised to see her kind of remain at the fringe of the meta. I don't think she'll quite make it in just because like some of these mage matchups are too hard. But just as a solo queue champ, Zoe is always pretty solid. So it's definitely something you could consider. If you guys used to play Zoe, now could be a good time to put some games on her again. Coming down to B tier, I think these are all champions that are definitely good in specific situations, or in other words, can be considered, you know, very viable and potentially even strong, but just not as strong as the things above them. I will say that while I have put some effort into ordering this, it's definitely not as good as the ordering above it, right? Like, I think you can make pretty good arguments for swapping things around just depending on what you value. But overall, yeah, I think all these champions are solid and have some decent situations to be picked in. The ones I specifically want to talk about is, first one is Gwen. So there's been a lot of talk on Twitter about Gwen mid, and I actually think it's not too bad, but it's also not too great. So the thing is, I think Gwen is a super broken champion. I think that if you can get any excuse to play Gwen, you probably should, because the champ's amazing. But I do think a lot of mage matchups mid, especially ones with mobility or phase rush, can be really, really difficult to Gwen. Personally, I haven't lost to a Gwen mid yet. I've dealt with it really well on Ahri. I played a really good Ori game against one. I had a great Azir game against one in way back. But basically, I think if you can get a good counter pick, like if you can end up into a melee matchup or something that can't really punish you or doesn't have a way of running away from you, I think potentially can be really good. Mainly just, again, not even because Gwen is so much a great mid, but just because I swear to God, Gwen is so broken, and you just want to put her somewhere on the rift right now, and it just so happens that mid's another lane where sometimes people blind pick things that are a bit suspicious, and you can get a really good Gwen angle. Malzahar is one I really want to talk about as well, because I think Malzahar is simultaneously like OP as fuck while also being kind of trash. So the biggest problem Malzahar has is that he gets punished too hard in lane, right? Like in higher elos, it's just way too hard to get through most meta matchups as Malz. If you play against an Ori, a Hwei, or Syndra, or even some of the ones up here, you're just going to get absolutely blasted. The thing is though, especially in lower elos where people don't know how to punish the laning phase, or if you're kind of like getting close to high elo, but people aren't like meta slaving yet. I think Malz is really, really OP. Like I think being able to go Blackfire Liandry into either Deathcap or, you know, Raleigh if you need it. But I like just Blackfire Liandry Deathcap. You do so much damage, and Malz scaling is absolutely ridiculous. It's just that he gets punished so hard in lane. So this is one of those champs where if you can be on the lookout for like a free Malz pick, I actually think it's really good. But one that I kind of have to rate lower just because, again, in high elo, it should be impossible to get away with. That being said, again, lower elos, absolutely turbo broken. Anivia is another one I wanted to talk about on this list. And the reason is that I saw a lot of talk about Anivia being high win rate. And I think Anivia in some senses is underrated. I think she's really, really good into short range compositions. And I think a lot of Anivia's kind of lack of success, at least when I play against her, is I feel like their builds are kind of bad. And the main reason for that is because in a lot of the difficult Anivia matchups, you kind of have to go Roa. And it's just too hard to survive without it, right? Like you need Catalyst in order to neutralize the laning phase. But the problem with having Roa in your build is it basically completely kills your chance to do damage. Because if you do something like, you know, I often see Roa, Seraph, Zhonya's, you might as well just do no damage, right? I think better builds are to either go double mana Death Cap, so like something like Malignance or Blackfire with Seraphs into Deathcap, or even something like Malignance, Liandry, Deathcap. I think those builds are a lot better. You do sacrifice a lot of safety, and you probably can't play this every game, because again, in those more difficult matchups, you kind of need Roa. But I think Anivia is somewhat similar to Cassio, where you actually want to be picking her around that. Like I specifically try and avoid difficult matchups as Cassio to make sure that I can build what I think is the good build, essentially. So yeah, I don't know. Kind of decent champ, maybe underrated, but again, really struggles against meta mages. And I think its niche of being good against short range is kind of covered better by Talia, and even some things like Lissandra for CC. So not a huge fan of it. Azir I've put at the very bottom of B tier. I can't remember, I think I put him in C tier in the last one. I do think Azir is okay, but kind of feels not great. So I think Conqueror is better than Tempo from what I feel. I did try some things. I tried Lichbane on Azir, didn't feel that great. Did not deal a whole lot of damage with it, even though you can apply it. I kind of feel like just going either Nashers into Liandry like you used to is the best, or maybe Shadow Flame if you're solo EP might just be more damage, especially in the squishies. But the thing is, it's like, okay, if we really want a champ that we're picking like purely for kind of like, well, I don't know, it's hard. Like the thing with Azir is always that he's been very well rounded, right? He's always had like good engage, disengage, a lot of strong lane, scaling utility. Like he has a lot in his kit. But I kind of feel like he doesn't work with the current AD junglers as well as like some of the ones up here. He is good at surviving the ganks, but like I would say loses lane to all three of these champs. And it kind of feels like he doesn't have a super good payoff. Like he does scale very well, but like honestly, so do these champs. Not quite as good as Azir maybe, but I feel like they're a lot stronger early and in skirmishes. And I think the Azir payoff just takes a bit too long. So yeah, that's kind of my opinion. In C tier, the only two champs I really want to mention are Swain and Tristana. So Swain, I think, I don't know, like I think that Swain is really good in his games, but I just don't think you'll ever, at least in higher lows, you're never going to see those games on this patch. And again, the reason for that is because like almost all the champs being picked are like these ranged mages, right? I think Swain is quite good into champs like Galio, and if you see a blind pick Galio, then like feel free to look for something like that. The thing is, there'll still be other picks you can go for with a blind Galio, right? Like you would be happy to play one of these anyway. You can also look for something like a Silas or a Talia or something like that. I think that, yeah, I don't know, just the Swain feels like it's not really worth it. Swain is getting some pretty major changes soon, so hopefully when those come out, he'll end up going up. But I think Swain is, it's not so much that he's weak at his niche, it's that his niche is currently so uncommon in mid that there really isn't much point to pick him. At least that's my opinion. I think if you do get a good Swain game, though, he actually is a very good champ. Tristana is the last one I wanted to talk about. So I kind of feel like Trist is, I don't know, probably not deserving of C tier. Honestly, she probably should go higher. The thing is, I have not really seen success from Tristana's. I think that there's a couple different builds going around. I remember there is still, you know, the Bork Navori, I think Bork Navori IE was the build that people were going, but there are ADC changes this patch. And I know some people have been playing other builds. I actually can't remember them off the top of my head, but builds where you rush a crit item first. So maybe there's something for that. The thing is though, like Tristana kind of needs Bork to be played mid. And the reason is that with Fleet and Absorb life nerfs, and now like a Grasp nerf as well, like you can't really run any of these, so you need sustain from somewhere in order to survive the poke from these champs. And I just don't think you can get that without Bork, but it also feels like yeah, it feels like even with Bork, like maybe they've been nerfed so much that these champs just bully you out. So in that sense, like maybe Tristana is kind of similar to Swain, where like okay, she's like too hard to play into the current meta champs, but if you get a free Trist game, like maybe if someone blind picks Galio, or maybe someone blind picks Ahri or something, like that actually could be a pretty good Trist game. And I know that some players did experiment with Trist on the previous patch, like Zeka, for example, while he was still in Korea, played a fair amount of Trist on the new patch, and it seemed to be doing good. So I don't know, probably I don't know. I want to say it should be higher, but I just haven't seen it be successful at all. Probably the champ with the biggest potential to move anywhere else on this list. I just want to wrap up the video by talking about the best blind picks and my personal method for picking. So I think that when it comes to blind picks, there's a few different methods you can use. One is to just pick the most OP champs, right? So currently, you could probably blind pick any of these 4 champs, and even if it's not like the best game for that champion, it's probably still fairly solid because the champ overall is just overtuned. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is to kind of blind pick around your comp. So for example, even if you haven't seen the enemy mid, you can oftentimes just pick a champ that goes really well with your comp or is really good into their comp. And even if your lane matchup isn't quite that great, you can probably just win from kind of the team fight win condition. And the other way to blind pick is just to kind of pick champs that are traditionally good blinds. Even though like maybe they're not as good in the meta, they tend to be like safe or good at neutralizing. So I'll kind of run you through some examples of each. So I think Ori, again, she is OP, also a great blind because she deals with a lot of different matchups really well and a lot of different team comps really well. Hwei, for similar reasons, pretty good matchups, can deal with basically anything. Lissandra is probably the weakest blind of the ones up here. I think that she is still a good blind, but it's probably not quite the same level as these just because she does have some bad matchups. That being said, you almost never run into a bad comp with Lissandra. And a lot of the time, like, you know, if you pick Lissandra after seeing like a bunch of champs that are short range or a bunch of champs you can dive with or whatever, it really won't matter what the enemy mid picks because you'll just absolutely run away with the game. I think Syndra is normally, honestly, not a good blind. She's probably okay as a blind now just because she's overtuned, but I think that this is riskier than the other ones, mainly because she's more counterable, both by engage comps as well as like matchups. So you can definitely still blind her, but it's probably not as good as some of the others. Other really good blinds in this list, I think LeBlanc is always a pretty solid blind. Personally, I think, okay, if I were playing in very high-low, I would probably ban Lissandra when I'm playing LeBlanc. The thing is, though, I mean, I've been playing a lot in US Master, and I still have not encountered a Lissandra that knows how to play the matchup. So, in that sense, I think LeBlanc's a pretty good blind. You can play against just about anything and be fine. Ahri, also a solid blind, like has a lot of mobility, good at neutralizing, probably isn't as good as some of the others as a blind at the moment, just because the matchups can be a little hard. But if you have a ganking AD jungler, like you can probably deal with just about anything. And then there's kind of like other blinds that might be good because of just like flexes or random things. So like, for example, if you have like a Galio and a Rel on your team, like that can be a pretty good game for Galio. Or did I say Galio and Rel? I meant Jarvan and Rel. I don't know what I said. But basically, if you have engaged champs, Galio can be a good blind. Aurora can be a good blind as well, mainly because she's a flex with top lane. And actually, Aurora goes top lane more often than mid. So in that sense, you can kind of blind Aurora and they won't know for sure if it's going mid or top. Also, a lot of the matchups that counter Aurora in lane actually get countered by Aurora in team fights. So for example, if you pick Syndra, you do kind of hard shit on Aurora in lane, but the team fights will be really hard, especially if you play against something like Aurora Vi. So that's something there. I think Nico's pretty good. Nico hard to beat in lane, a flex pick as well, so that's not bad. I think those are like the main like high tier blinds, but there's always just like other things here, right? Like there's lots of flexes, there's things like Lux that are very hard to punish, good safety champs like Azir, or even some of the champs down here like that are flex pick specifically. Like if you blind something like Zillion, like no one's gonna know what to play into that. So that can probably be fine, but I would generally recommend sticking to some of the champs up here. I'll just quickly go through kind of my experience playing on this patch. So I have 2 accounts. I have this account which I play on stream and this account which I play off stream. And as you can see, like basically what I do is I pretty much just like pick Ori if it's open and I'm blind picking, right? Pretty much as simple as that. The only kind of exception to that is if I'm playing against, I don't know, something that looks very dangerous for Ori. Like if I were playing, I think this game, I can't quite remember, but this game might have been one of those where like I saw that they had a ton of threatening picks already and I really needed to play something a little bit safer. I think I ended up blinding LeBlanc, but to be honest, I can't really remember. Lissandra, I've been using as a counter pick all the time, and I've been playing Lissandra into, well, if we just go have a look, mainly assassins or short range, so I'll just show you guys. So on this account here, I think the reset was somewhere down here, I can't quite remember, but obviously good into Akali, good into LeBlanc, good into Ahri, again, Akali, LeBlanc, Akali, Katarina, LeBlanc, so like lots of counter picking, and it's been going really, really well. On this account, I think I've blinded it a little bit more, actually can't quite remember. Against LeBlanc there, LeBlanc, Talon. Okay, actually, no, I think I am just countering with it. But at the same time, like I do think you can blind pick this champ if you want. It's mainly just for me, I've just been blind picking Ori every game. And when I have been blind picking Ori, I often go for phase rush if I feel like I need the safety, even against some of the other account, even against some of the range champs. Like I kind of talk about it in my videos, but generally you go for Comet against range champs to try and punish them. But sometimes, like if you play against a champ like Swain, even though he's ranged, it's really helpful to have phase rush against this sort of composition. So that can be something to think about as well. But generally, like pretty much any matchup will be fine for Ori, and most team comps are fine as well. So yeah, hopefully that clears up a little bit for of the blind picking situation for you guys. If you have any more questions about the tier list or anything that I've covered in this video, please feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.